With nothing to gain for the playoffs, the Philadelphia Eagles are going to rest key players. While we don't get to see Saquon attempt to set the rushing record, this gives us an opportunity for younger players to make an impression, while also giving the team some recovery time after having the earliest bye week possible. Welcome to the Philly Film Room Podcast. Along with my co-host Eric Sidewater, I'm Nick Waters, and today we have another great podcast for you. It's going to be a little bit different than our normal preview pods because it's probably going to be a lot of backup players playing in this game, but now that we know Saquon Barkley isn't going for the rushing record, I think a lot of fans have been split over that decision from Nick Sirianni. But Eric, what do you think about that move? Do you think it was the right move or what?
I've been thinking about it a little bit differently from what I've seen in discussions online. The first thing is, let's say he plays. He's not guaranteed to get the record. You're talking about a Giants team that will fight tooth and nail to stop him from gaining a single yard, because how bad will that look on them? That these guys are professionals and they have pride. They're going to stack the box with 9 guys every time. And Saquon's going to be running behind backup offensive line. And then let's say he's close to the record, but then he keeps getting stuffed. Are you going to run him 30 times just to get 1 yard over the record? Now, there's some people who maybe thinks he just trots out there and gets it in a half. I don't think that's realistic at all, especially considering how much the Giants would want to prevent him from doing that. And then at the end of the day, let's say he does get it. There's still the asterisk that he had an extra game versus Dickerson. And I understand people say, well, he had more games than the guy who had 14 before, and you could just extrapolate that into infinity. But the reward is almost nothing. Just, I understand the legacy part of it for Saquon, and for him specifically, I could understand why he wants to get it. He talked about how he said at first he didn't care, because we know he's a team first guy. We saw it earlier in the year when he could have had his career single game record, and he said, nah, put the other guys in. Then later in the season, he ended up getting it. So I don't care about the rushing record. I do care about him staying healthy, and he's already at 340 something carries. Does he need another 25, 30 just to get that record? And it's not like a running back gets rusty. So I'd rather just save his legs. That's kind of my thoughts on it. How about for you?
Yeah, I think we're going to have to start talking about these records in terms of like per game measurements, because especially as the NFL, they're talking about they're very close to, or they might have already signed it into effect, but they're going to go to 18 games at some point in time. How are we going to continue to look at all these records when we're now playing 2 more games than the 16 game records and 4 more games than the 14 game records that were set? Like OJ Simpson getting 2,000 rushing yards in 14 games, right? How is that? How are you going to, compare era to era if you're just going off of total yards? I mean, I think it's going to become something where in the NBA, you're looking at per game numbers for the most part, right? So I think we're going to start looking at that a little bit as well. Yards per carry, especially when you're getting up to 300 plus carries in a season, that's probably a bigger, a more important factor as well, is who has been more efficient on their carries. And Saquon has been more efficient with his carries than Eric Dickerson up to this point in the season. But I'm with you. I don't think they should have played him. If he was like 20, 30 yards away, then I could get it. I would understand you go out there and you give him, 6 to 10 carries, whatever it takes to get that. But if you're sitting here having to pound and push to get this guy over 100 yards, it might be, listen, you look at what this team has been the past couple of weeks. They've struggled to run the ball against some teams that haven't really been the best of run defenses, right? So it's not guaranteed that they would come out and get it at least early in the game, right? I think if he played the whole game, I think he would get it, but it's not guaranteed that he gets it if in the first quarter or the first half, right? So, but when this season started, when this team met and OTAs, and they set their goals for the season, the goal was for this team to win a Super Bowl. It wasn't for Saquon Barkley to set the rushing record. If that were to happen in the process of getting there, then that's one thing. Or if, like I said, if Saquon was much closer, only needing 20 to 30 yards, that's a completely different thing, But there's a bigger picture in mind. You can't really go through and say, well, this one player's record is more important than the rest of the team and their priority, right? There's 90 plus players in the offseason with practice squads, with guys in OTAs, add in the coaching staff. All these guys worked all offseason, all summer long to accomplish a specific goal. And you don't want to put that and throw that aside because of one person's individual goals. And if that were to happen, what would the messaging from Sirianni, what would his impact be? I feel like it would be watered down a little bit when he's talked about so much of it as a team first approach, right? And then you go and say, okay, we're close to, we have a chance to really be one of the most dominant teams all season and then dominant in the playoffs. We have that opportunity to go in fairly healthy, and then we're going to throw that to the side so one guy can get a record. I think that just waters down the approach, and then I think that would carry over into the next offseason as well. So I don't know. I could see both sides, but I don't know.
Right. We still need this guy next year. And I remember you could probably clip us from the offseason. I think we talked about him in the 275 carry range. And if he played a full game, he'd be in the 370 carry range. So he already has enough miles on the tires. I understand having the name up at the top is nice, but 2000's sick too. So let's just be happy with that.
Yeah, I mean, that's an exclusive club. And I think that it really showed last week when they really pushed to get him to 2,000 yards. And as soon as that happened, they took him out. I think they knew at that point in time, because they didn't, especially against the Steelers, didn't get the rushing yards that he really needed in that game. They didn't come out early, like in the Cowboys game, and have him get a ton of yards early in that game. I feel like things would have been a little bit differently if the previous games had gone a little bit different in his pursuit of the rushing record. But listen, it's still been a great season. It's a very memorable season. People will remember this season from Saquon Barkley throughout history. It's not going to get forgotten about. There's only 9 guys that have ever gone over 2,000 yards, so it's not anything to scoff at, right? But what do you think about Jalen this week? Were you on board for him playing to, quote unquote, get the rust off of him for not playing potentially 3 weeks in a row leading into the playoffs?
So, as opposed to running back, I think it's way more relevant for quarterbacks, and probably the most of any position to shake off the rust. And so the way I kind of was viewing it is, if I'm a coach at practice, quarterback coach say, and Jalen's all over the map and showing signs of rust in practice, I would want to get him some game reps. And you can design an offense where you're really protecting the quarterback. Have them airmail it. It doesn't matter if the Eagles lose by 50. Take a intentional grounding. Never take a hit. Just airmail it. No QB design runs. Quick hitters. I think you can knock off the rust that way. Now, if he looks how he always has looked in practice, no reason to trot him out there. That's kind of how I'm viewing it. What do you think?
Yeah, that's an interesting point to see how he is preparing throughout the week. I think one thing that is important to think about is this isn't like knocking off the rust of an entire offseason where he hasn't played football. It's different when you went through all preseason, didn't play, and then it's your first game of the season. That's a little bit different than a situation where he hasn't played in 3 weeks, right? And when you look at Patrick Mahomes, he's going to end up in a very similar situation. Now that they got the bye week in the first round, it's going to be a similar situation for Patrick Mahomes, right? I don't think you necessarily have to throw him out there. I think, like you said, if he is performing well in practice, I think that's good enough. But you also got to factor in, if Jalen's going to be out there, then they're not going to put him out there with Anaya Smith, Johnny Wilson, and Jahan Dotson at receiver and a backup offensive line. You're putting out every starter at that point in time to play as well. And what's the risk reward profile at that point in time to knock off a little bit of rust, even if there is any, right? Or the downside is, like we saw last year in the last game of the season, AJ Brown went down, missed the next game. Reed Blankenship went down, missed the next game in the playoffs, right? That had big effects. You had Sidney Brown tore his ACL. That had a long-lasting butterfly effect where now he didn't get any reps in training camp. He falls behind in the pecking order with a new defensive coordinator that has come in, and he's like 4th or 5th on the depth chart for safeties when we thought he was a guy that would potentially be rotating in certain positions on the defense. The guy hasn't been able to get any playing time, so when guys have to go out there, everyone else has to go out there. You don't know what might happen where you can try and protect these guys, but football is football. Offensive linemen get rolled up on. Mekhi Becton got rolled up on last week. He got Kenny Pickett got knocked into him. It was just a play where it was nothing involved with the play really. But Kenny Pickett gets knocked into him. He gets his ankle rolled up on. CJ Gardner-Johnson gets his ankle stepped on. You don't know what's going to happen in these plays. The Reed Blankenship injury, he got an interception, and I think he landed on Bradbury's foot or something like that, and had a knee injury. So it's just impossible to really know what's going to happen. I know you can get injured in practice, and you could get injured walking around. You could get, some, tragic, I shouldn't say tragic, I don't want to say that, but accidents happen in life. You never know what could happen, but your risk of injury playing in the game is higher than anything else that they could be doing. So I just don't think the risk reward profile is worth it, especially when the Eagles have an injury advantage over much of the teams that they're going to be playing, or much of the teams that are going into the playoffs. You look at the Detroit Lions. Today, the Packers are ending Jair Alexander's season, right? We have that advantage of being pretty healthy going into the playoffs. There's no need to risk that and put that at jeopardy and give that away just to knock off some rust. And the team started slow anyways, right? So how do we know that he knocks off rust for a couple series in this game, and they're still not going to start slow in the next game,
And it's control your controllables. You have the ability to, really dedicate yourself at practice, lock in, focus, do everything you need to do to get rid of rust. You actually have agency over that. Whereas an injury, you could be doing nothing wrong at all and just get injured because someone else does some crazy thing or just by happenstance. So I'd much rather roll the dice on the thing that I actually have some say over. But like I said, I don't want to contradict myself. If Jalen is all over the map in practice, he may just need those reps. And I wouldn't be upset if he played like 2 drives in that scenario.
Yeah, it could be something like that. And if you go back and look at the 2004 season, someone on Twitter actually commented that to me, and they talked about how in the 2004 season, it was not the last game, but the game before the last game. I think Donovan McNabb played like 2 series. They didn't play the next week, and they had a first round bye. So it's like it's not unprecedented for this to happen, right? So where quarterbacks rest a little bit going into the postseason. And then you also got to factor in this team's bye week was week 5. I feel like this team is a little beat up, a little worn down. And someone actually commented in one of the comments on the last video, the review podcast, about how maybe this offensive line is getting worn down. Maybe the defensive line is getting worn down. And that's why you see Rico Dowdle go for 100 yards. Maybe that's why you're seeing this offensive line is struggling a little bit. They're not quite as dominant as we've seen like in the Rams game or in some of the games where they were just mauling the opposing defensive lines. They're not as dominant as they were earlier in the season. Maybe it's an accumulation of just tired legs. Maybe a rest week will be good for this team, and I think it will be. But as we move on to the rest of the podcast, we want to talk about some, really as for the starters, the regular season is pretty much wrapped up unless they play a couple series here or there. So we want to talk a little bit about the regular season and what are biggest surprises of this regular season. Why was this team able to bounce back and be so dominant? So Eric, what was your biggest surprise of this regular season?
Zach Bond by a mile. When we talked about him in the offseason, we were hoping he would be a poor man's Andrew Van Ginkel, where he plays a little edge, plays a little off-ball linebacker, and is solid and serviceable. And he played close to Luke Kuechly levels. It's unfathomable. If you told me that in the offseason, I would say you don't know what you're talking about. It's completely blown my mind. Now, I don't want revisionist history to happen on this. How we brought him in as a role player, special teams kind of depth piece. Fangio's the guy who said, no, this guy could be a starting off-ball linebacker. It's all credit to Fangio. Fangio is a linebacker guru. He has been his whole career. And to turn Bond, and I want to give Bond credit, he clearly was chomping at the bit for this opportunity. He sees that opportunity and made the most of it, and now he's going to get a payday. Good for him. And frankly, he should be in the Defensive Player of the Year conversation. That's my biggest surprise.
Yeah, I mean, and there isn't a bigger surprise of the team than Zach Bond, right? And you said it right? He should be in the defensive player of the year conversation. I think his odds are somewhere around 10th. He should be in the top 5. There's not anyone that's really standing out and is having a year where it's like, this guy's for sure the defensive player of the year. If Zach Bond was a well-known name, if he was drafted as a linebacker in the first or even second round, if he went to Alabama or Georgia and came out of one of those schools and was putting up the season, or if he had made a Pro Bowl in a previous season and then had this season, people would be talking about him as a runaway defensive player of the year. But because he's relatively unknown, people don't want to give it to players that have really shown and hit the stage for the first time and say, oh, this is a defensive player of the year. But the number one defense in terms of yards per game allowed, number 3, I think, in points per game. And you take the player that is currently, as of right now, first in the NFL in solo tackles, according to the NFL's official website. He has the most stops, meaning the most tackles that constitute as a negative play for the offense, the most stops by PFF and Next Gen Stats. He's second in forced fumbles, 6th in yards per target. And his versatility of all the things he can do, shifting to the edge. You talked about it. We thought he could be a poor man's Andrew Van Ginkel. Well, he's about to be a rich man's Andrew Van Ginkel, right? So Zach Bond is definitely the biggest surprise. I hope he's probably not going to, but I hope he can win Defensive Player of the Year because he's definitely played like one of the best players. But my biggest surprise, I will say, well, is Zach Bond. I'm not going to steal what you took, but I'm going to go Milton Williams as the pass rusher. Milton Williams, the pass rusher. We already knew he was a good run defender coming into the season. That was what he was best at last season. And one of our biggest concerns coming into the season is who's going to be a pass rusher to pair on the interior next to Jalen Carter, right? Because we anticipated Jalen Carter would get a lot of attention, a lot of double teams. Who was going to be that guy that would step up this year? And it has been Milton Williams passing with flying colors, right? He's stepped up tremendously. First in pass rush win rate among interior defensive linemen with a minimum of 100 pass rush snaps. Third in pressure rate. His 14.4 pressure rate is nearly double from what it was last year at 7.5%. That ranks 75th among all interior defensive linemen. His pass rush win rate is 18.5%. That more than doubled. It was 7.2% last year, and that was tied for 79th. A lot of people will say that, it's the Jalen Carter effect, which definitely plays a factor in it. He is getting a lot of one-on-one opportunities, but you still have to win your one-on-one opportunities, and not everyone does. Just because you have a one-on-one doesn't mean that you're going to win them. If I had to go out there and go against offensive guards, pass rushing on one-on-ones, I wouldn't win ever, right? But you still have to go out there and do it, right? If you look at the Chiefs' second interior defensive lineman and pass rush snaps next to Chris Jones, because Chris Jones gets all the attention on the Chiefs, right? He's 28th in pass rush win rate, and his pressure rate is something like 64th, right? So just because you're playing next to a good player doesn't mean you're good too. You still have to go out there and show it. Milton Williams has showed it. One more thing to bring up about it. Brandon Thorne released some of his pressure ratings where he goes through and looks at the quality of pressures. Milton Williams, I believe, had the 3rd best pressure quality rate in the NFL. So it's not like he's just getting a bunch of unblocked pressures. He's beating guys with quality moves, and he's beating quality pass blockers, right? So I thought Milton Williams had a big year and is a big reason why this defense took a step forward. But moving on to the next topic is we want to discuss a little bit, because I know there's a lot of discussions about the Kenny Pickett versus Tanner McKee, and we're not really here to get into that. I'm not trying to blow up the comments and with a bunch of things can get a little hectic when you get into this conversation. But I think it'd be a good idea to talk about some of the differences, some of the things you get with Kenny Pickett, some of the things you don't get with him, and what are some of the things you get with Tanner McKee and don't get with Tanner McKee. Because as we saw last week, both these guys and the right opportunity can produce, right? So, Eric, what did you think about Kenny Pickett and Tanner McKee from what you've seen so far this season?
I liked what I've seen from Pickett. He had that terrible interception, but Frankie Louvu did an awesome job baiting it, so it probably looked a lot worse than it truly was. What I have been very surprised by, impressed by, is his deep ball. Looks awesome, and he's not afraid to throw it, and he knows teams are going to stack the box. He's getting the one-on-one opportunities downfield, and he's making teams pay for it. So that's all you can ask for. And he's pretty mobile. Now, he doesn't seem to have a good sense of when or where to run, but if he does get an opening, he can move pretty good, and that's always a plus. McKee, he's definitely a statue type quarterback in the mold of a Goff or Stafford. But there's just so limited tape, NFL tape, obviously, on him that it's hard to evaluate. I think he's an accurate quarterback who's got a pretty good, arm, but he's not going to improvise. He's not going to make plays outside the pocket. It's unclear if he will be turnover prone or not. So, if just to wrap it up, if I had to pick between them, I'd go with Pickett because it's more of a known commodity, and he has mitigated turnovers in the past, and he's won games. He's won NFL games. So I do like Pickett probably more than the fan base does from what I've seen. And I'm not quite as sold on McKee just because the lack of tape. That's kind of where I fall. How about for you?
Yeah, I think Kenny is number one. The experience that he has, like you talked about, he started 25 games in the NFL. He's 15-10 in those games, right? So he has experience that you feel like you can trust in a backup quarterback. And I've tried to talk about in the previous podcast, the world of backup quarterbacks is very diverse. It really drops off, off a cliff. It really starts to drop off a cliff and the difference between the top quarterbacks, middling quarterbacks, and then there's not enough starting quarterbacks to go around in the National Football League, right? So what you can get with backup quarterbacks can be pretty drastic, right? But Kenny Pickett's good enough to win games in the NFL, provided he has the right circumstances. He'll also lose you games at times too, but what you said, he doesn't turn the ball over a lot. He doesn't put the ball in harm's way a lot for the most part. I think he does a good job progressing through his reads fairly quickly. He doesn't get stuck on one guy for the most part. He will aggressively push the ball to his top wideouts, which I think is an important thing, is not being scared to give your best guys an opportunity to go make plays. And he has enough mobility to make plays with his legs, whether that's extending and creating down the field like we saw with that Grant Calcaterra catch, or if there's an opening to take 5 to 7 yards that's available, I think he can do that on a pretty consistent basis, right? And he can also help keep defenses honest in the run game if you want to run read option with him. He has enough mobility where you can't just ignore him and crash down on the running back, right? So I think he gives you that element, but I do think he's fairly inaccurate. I think that comes down to his arm talent. I think it messes up his mechanics a little bit, and I think he can get uncomfortable in the pocket. You see him progressing through his reads sometimes a little bit too quickly, getting to his check down instead of getting to second and third parts of the read. You see him get happy feet sometimes. So, you got to take the good with the bad. But with Tanner McKee, I think he has better arm talent. I think he's much more accurate than Kenny Pickett. I think he throws with good anticipation, excels in the quick game and intermediate game. I think he progresses through his reads pretty quickly as well. And he's also not scared to give his receivers an opportunity to go up and make plays on the ball, whether it's back shoulder fades, or throwing with precision on out routes on the sideline, corner routes to the sideline. And I think he has better speed than he's given credit for. But I don't think he's like Tom Brady level athleticism. I think he's a better athlete than Tom Brady, but he doesn't have that ability to force teams to honor him in the run game. So your run game has to change up a little bit when he is at quarterback. I think he lacks the agility to evade pass rushers consistently. So if a guy's in his face, I don't think he has that quickness to make guys miss and extend plays. And sometimes he will get to his check down a little bit too quickly instead of pushing the ball down the field. But like you said, a lot of this is based off of preseason film. It's one thing to watch him play against preseason players, guys that can't break and close on routes as quickly. They give up more space in general. The schemes are a little bit more vanilla. So it's kind of hard to truly evaluate a guy like Tanner McKee when he is not out there playing with against some of the better defenders. But he did everything he should have done in the limited reps he got last game. So I'm excited to see him this week. And I think he probably is going to get the vast majority of the playing time this upcoming week. And I think with McKee and the right scenario, I think he is a guy that he needs a good offensive line. And I think he needs good receivers that can win one-on-one, because if protection breaks down and he's playing behind an average or below average offensive line, he's not a guy that can find space and get out of trouble, right? So I think he's similar to Nick Foles in that if you put him behind a good offensive line, I think you can win with him in the NFL. But he needs to be on a team like the Eagles that has a good offensive line. But did you have any thoughts on who is going to play quarterback this week?
I don't know, because I could just imagine McKee goes out there with the backup O-line and a bunch of our small receivers at the back of the depth chart, and the Giants defensive line, and he just gets absolutely obliterated. So I don't really know that. I'd probably give Pickett some reps because there's a chance he might need to come in for a drive or a series in the playoffs, and I'd want him to get those reps if he's first in line.
Yeah, I do wonder about the severity of his broken ribs. You know, if they're gonna be wanting to put him out there. That's one of my concerns for that. I think that you kind of want to McKee has shown enough in the preseason. He's shown enough last game when he got to play that I'd like to see an extended look for him, even if he is playing behind a bad offensive line. You know, can he get the ball out of his hands quickly? Can they figure out ways to win with him back there? Let's not forget this. They don't have Dexter Lawrence. He's out for the year, right? So can they? I think that definitely helps the offensive line in protection. Now they have other pass rushers for the Giants that you need to watch out for. But it's not like this is a good Giants defense overall. I'd be interested to see McKee go out there and have some extended playing time. But when we look at who is going to play, I went through and started looking at the roster and the depth charts and looking at some of the positions where, you know, it's pretty much set who's going to be playing on the offensive line in my eyes. Fred Johnson at left tackle, Darian Kennard at tackle, Trevor Keegan, Jack Driscoll at guard are my thoughts, Nick Gates at offense at center. I think all three tight ends outside of Goddard will play. I think Jahan Dotson, Johnny Wilson, and Nia Smith are going to play. I think it gets interesting at a few positions. Running back, Saquon's not going to play. Will Shipley and Kenneth Gainwell, the only guys on the active roster on the active roster right now. So do they want to put Kenny Gainwell out there to potentially, you know, be at risk for injury when he has been a key piece for them this season? And Will Shipley hasn't progressed through concussion protocol yet. He started practicing this week. He was limited in the walkthrough today, so looks like he's on track to play. But do they call up Ty Davis Price and to be able to play? Also, I want to add in one thing. Ian Book is on the active roster right now. Maybe they cut him to open up space because you can only bring up 2 players from the practice squad for practice squad elevation. So they currently have 4 quarterbacks on the active roster right now. Maybe they cut Ian Book and roll with Tanner McKee and Kenny Pickett this upcoming week to make room. Because where I think it's going to be most important to look at is on the defensive line, because you're going to have to give these dudes breaks. They can't sit here and play all 60 to 70 snaps and probably at the higher end of the snaps because it's going to be a backup offense that's going to be out there, right? You can't go out there and have Jalix Hunt playing 70 snaps. The guy's going to he's going to be throwing up on the field like he's Cam Scatterborough, you know, so you're going to have to give these guys some breaks. I think they're going to end up calling up Charles Harris on edge and then Gabe Hall on the interior defensive line so that Thomas Booker and probably Moro Ojomo get a break. But I think we see a lot of Jalix Hunt and Bryce Huff, which is like $17 million pass rusher. Now he's probably playing some snaps in a game where they're resting much of the starters. But I'll be interested to see who they have playing. But who are you actually looking forward to seeing this week from the backups?
I'm interested in watching Hunt because there's not a lot of edge rushers that are going to be on the roster next year, so he's in line to play snaps. But to me, the most important is Isaiah Rodgers, because there's a really good chance he plays in the playoffs. Number one, they've pretty much issued Maddox in dime and put Rodgers in there, so when they're in like third and really long, he's going to be in the game. And Slay's gone out almost every game, at least a drive, and so Rodgers will go in there. I thought he's done a fantastic job when he has. It's not, I mean, you were a corner. You know better than me. Just getting out there cold in the middle of the game, and then right away you have to like play against NFL receivers. A lot of people have criticized him, but considering the circumstances, I think he's done a phenomenal job. So that's really who I'm eyeing. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I didn't play in the NFL, but when I was playing, I never had to come off the bench, so I don't know what that's like. But I do imagine that that it is very difficult to come off the bench and then, you know, especially when it gets cold and late in the season, and then have to go keep up with Jamar Chase down the sideline, right? So it is something to watch. I do wonder how much they are going to have him play, just due to the points that you made about he is going to be an important piece in the offseason and the playoffs, excuse me. Slay has gone out pretty much at some points in the game, every single game. And then he is going to be playing in dime. So I do wonder how much, if he plays, I feel like it'll be like a first quarter to a first half type of deal. Then you're going to see Eli Ricks probably play a good amount as well. I'm with you with Jalen Hunt, though. Not only do I want to see him play more, but he needs a development. He's been good as a run defender. He still needs to grow as a pass rusher, which is to be expected. So it'll be a good opportunity for him to go out there and get extended reps. But I'm interested to see Jeremiah Trotter Jr. What does he look like with extended reps against NFL competition, right? And not preseason backup competition. Because when we look at this roster next year, it's not a given that Zach Bond is going to be back. Especially, we're talking about him being a potential defensive player of the year. He's probably going to price himself out of the range where Howie Roseman wants to pay at linebacker, right? So and they hit on Zach Bond this offseason. How are we going to go back and say, hey, Fangio, go and find us another diamond in the rough? Do they trust that? I don't know. I feel like they're going to make every effort to bring Zach Bond back. I really hope they bring him back, but I wouldn't be surprised if he's not back. And if he's not back, we're going to be looking to see, does Jeremiah Trotter, can he show out in his audition to give the Eagles confidence that they can move on from Zach Bond? Personally, I'm not sure that can happen, but we'll see what happens on the field. I just don't think when you look at the two players matched up physically, he's not going to bring what Zach Bond can bring on the field with everything he can do. He can't match Bond's versatility with what he can do rotating to the edge as a blitzer, as a pass rusher. He can blitz a little bit, but he doesn't have the pass rush moves that Bond has. But more importantly, like covering in space, Zach Bond, the amount of times where he's dropped back to 12 yards deep, he gets in throwing windows, then immediately rallies to throw underneath and is in a good position to make a tackle, which is huge because a lot of times guys will get underneath, but because they're having to run their ass off, they're not in good position to make tackles. Then they end up missing tackles. But Zach Bond is not missing a whole lot of tackles, except for weeks when I say, hey, bet on Zach Bond to hit his over on tackles. But outside of that, he's missed very few tackles this season. And a big part of that is he has athleticism to get deep and then come up and be in good position to square up on tackles and get guys to the ground. I think that's an area where Jeremiah Trotter, I'm a little concerned with. So I want to pay attention to that this week. But do you have any thoughts on Trotter or anyone else from the backups that you're interested to see?
Yeah, I'm not too high on him. He really looks small out there. We already knew he was slow. And unless you have like Hall of Fame level instincts, that's hard to overcome. So maybe he can be a career special teamer. Maybe he'll have an unbelievable development and prove me wrong. I hope he does. But yeah, I think he'll be good to watch. I hope he does amazing. But there's just some things he may not be able to overcome just based off sheer, size and physical, speed, his athleticism. So.
Yeah, and Nakobe Dean, he's a little bit smaller, but Nakobe Dean is so physical. I don't know if Jeremiah Trotter has that part to his game, or he's as physical as Nakobe Dean. Zach Bond, he is physical as hell too, taking on offensive linemen. That is a concern. Will he get swallowed up by offensive linemen when they get up to the second level? Real quick though, I want to see Ainias Smith, how he does with Tanner McKee. I think that they had a pretty good connection in their last game against the Vikings together. So where McKee was getting the ball out of his hands quick on a lot of quick passing concepts. I feel like if they're going to be playing with a backup offensive lineman, you're going to see a lot of McKee to Ainias Smith in the slot, trying to move the sticks that way. But as we move on to what is important is this team and the playoffs as they push to try and win a Super Bowl. What are some of the strengths that you think this team can lean on as they make their Super Bowl push?
Well, as we talked about earlier, the Eagles had a 2,000-yard rusher. So teams, presumably, as they have done most of the year, will stack the box. And this is going to leave AJ and Devontae one-on-one opportunities down the field. We saw a little bit of it last week. I think there's going to be a lot of opportunities to harness the deep ball. It's something they did a lot and I wonder if the stats back this up. It seems like they did it a lot more in 23 than they did this season. but maybe they've just been holding it back a little bit because they're like, oh, listen, we can throw a deep ball anytime we want it. Um, and when they have done it this year, it's been to mixed results, but I'm not concerned about that. So to me, the deep ball is going to be extremely important, so that you get teams to not stack the box, so you can have more, first down runs for 6 and 7 yards, and then you're always keeping the defense honest. So, and one more thing I'll add is if you look at the NFC playoffs, the team potential opponents we could face, there's hardly any vaunted defensive backs across all the teams. Vikings probably have the best, but I was just looking at the depth charts of a lot of the potential opponents the Eagles would have. Now with Alexander out for the Packers, there's going to be tons of opportunities for AJ and Devontae to go against corners who are not nearly to their level. So that's really what I'm going to be looking at. How about for you?
Yeah, and the two teams that they're most likely to play in the first round of the playoffs, AJ Brown already tore up Jair Alexander. If we remember that out and up in week 1 of the season, right? And then AJ Brown was terrorizing Marshawn Lattimore, which I forgot to mention in the review podcast, but like that was why I wasn't too worried about Marshawn Lattimore coming to the Commanders, because if they're going to sit there and think they could play a lot of man coverage, they weren't going to slow down AJ Brown. And even with Kenny Pickett in the game, he was giving them problems, right? There's not a lot of corners that can slow down AJ Brown in this league. So yeah, I don't think there is a lot of good matchups for opposing defenses to try and slow them down. And then you add in what I think they're the thing they need to lean into, and which they have leaned into much of the season, is their run game, right? That run game works to help open up opportunities for AJ Brown and Devontae, like you mentioned, right? They're going to have to bring in extra guy in the box to try and slow down that run game. But leaning into the run game in the playoffs is huge. It's a proven formula to win in the playoffs, is having a good run game and having a good defense, right? Especially when you're playing much better offenses in the playoffs. You want to play and have this ball control offense where you keep the good quarterbacks on the sideline. That was always one of the things teams would try and do against the Peyton Mannings and the Tom Brady's of the world, because if you let them go out there and have 70-ish plays, the more times they get to see your defense, the better they're going to get at figuring out your defense. So you want to keep them off the field, keep them cold, especially in the playoffs, right? Keep them out of rhythm. And with a team that can run the ball as well as the Eagles, they need to get back to being able to do that well at the beginning of the games, not just in the second half, but get back to dominating on the ground like they were really dominating on the ground for much of the year until really towards the end of the season when they were starting to have some issues, right? But one thing that's going to help the run game is playoff Jalen Hurts. During the regular season, they're trying to protect Jalen to a degree and have him get to the playoffs healthy. But once the playoffs come, you take the training wheels off, you take the bubble wrap off, and that just allows Jalen to be more deadly and harder to stop, allows the run game to be harder to stop, right? And when you look at Jalen Hurts, he's not a Lamar Jackson out there running. He's not a Jaden Daniels out there running. He's not a guy that's outrunning a whole lot of people. He is more of a power runner, right? And you don't want to have him be a power runner too much in the regular season, but in the playoffs, when things are on the line, that's when that can shine, where he can try and muscle through tackles to get an extra few yards to get the first down, where you're more willing to run some of those quarterback run concepts that hit up the middle as opposed to as much zone read where he's going to the sideline, right? So I think we'll see a more aggressive running game with Jalen Hurts. And I think we'll see a little bit more actually diversity in the quarterback run game as well. I think there's a few concepts that we haven't seen quite as much that I think are probably going to get sprinkled in throughout the playoffs. So I think the run game is something that they can lean on and will continue to try and lean on, which I think is, I guess it was a low-hanging fruit option, right? But that is just what this team is, right? They're a run-first team. But looking at some of the weaknesses that might be the downfall of this team in the playoffs, where can this team be exploited? What are you worried about?
We saw a few examples of this in the regular season, is keeping the quarterback in the pocket, especially obviously the guys who can hurt you with their legs. A little bit of revisionist history. I don't think the Eagles shut down the Ravens. If you recall, the Ravens had like 3, 4, maybe even more plays that they botched what just a bad throw or drop, whatever. So they could have put up more points. But all that to say, they didn't necessarily do a great job of containing Lamar. Lamar turned down many opportunities to run for whatever reason. I have no idea. We talked about it, how I said the Eagles need to be vigilant about Jaden Daniels. He may have been banged up in the first game. He's a phenomenal runner, and he absolutely killed them on the ground, including that huge 4th down play. To me, it's mostly because of one main issue, especially on these 3rd down plays and throwing 4th down, is the defensive line seems to try to want to get around their guy any way possible, and they leave escape lanes. I understand why you'd want to do that. Sacks are awesome. But in a need to have it situation, I'd rather they just converge altogether, push the pocket, don't leave an escape lane, make him throw with a guy right in his face, maybe has to add a little bit more loft on it, and then you have plenty of guys in coverage. So that's just, it's something they've done much better this year than they did last year. Rush lane integrity, it's something we harped on all off season. It's been to a tremendous positive effect for the defense, but on those 3rd and 4th downs, they've kind of lost themselves on that. So they just need to stay focused on those downs and still rush as a unit. What weaknesses are you watching?
Well, I want to talk about the quarterback contain just for a second, because some things that will be very helpful for the Eagles is there isn't a whole lot of quarterbacks in the NFC that they're going to face that are true run threats outside of Jaden Daniels. Sam Darnold can hurt you with his legs, so can Baker Mayfield if you play him. It's not like they can't hurt you, but they're not quarterbacks that are looking to run. If you go back and you look at the Commanders game against the Falcons, it was just like Jaden Daniels run left, Jaden Daniels run right, Jaden Daniels run left, Jaden Daniels run right. That's like we were seeing like playoff Jaden Daniels get unleashed, where they were designing a whole lot of very fun run plays for Jaden Daniels and trying to contain him, whether it's quarterback design runs or trying to contain him as a passer. Is like Jaden was just looking to take off and run. So that is going to be something that they need to be cognizant about. If they end up playing the Commanders again, they could very well, if they make the Super Bowl, end up playing Josh Allen or Lamar Jackson. But at least on the path there, if they don't play the Commanders, they're not going to face too many quarterbacks that are going to truly hurt them consistently with chunk gains on the ground. So I think that is to the benefit of the Eagles. But you're right. They need to make sure that they are staying vigilant when they play these guys. Use more power rushes where you can convert and constrict the pocket, as opposed to trying to win with a whole lot of speed rushes, with a lot of fancy moves, trying to get around your guy. But were you about to add something?
The one thing I'd add is this could even extend to quarterbacks like Jared Goff. I see 5-6 times a game they do that fake handoff to the left, he rolls out to the right, and he either hits a guy in the flat or over the intermediate working towards the sidelines. And I'm dumbfounded how teams give it up every time. Now, I understand you have to commit a lot of guys to stop that run game, and so I understand it works off of that. But it's like this guy's so immobile, and he's just getting wide open on these like naked bootlegs, easiest completions ever. I'd like the Eagles to actually install some of that. But even on plays like that, I want to not allow the quarterback to escape the pocket and make these easy completions.
Yeah, for sure. You never want to let them escape the pocket. There's just more of a emphasis when you're playing the Lamars and the Jaden Daniels. We saw Bryce Young. He went out and extended a bunch of plays and was able to generate explosives by doing that. You definitely want to keep them contained for sure. But one thing I think could be exploited is when they play teams that have aggressive passing attacks. And you're going to see more aggressive passing attacks when you are in the playoffs. Teams that are in the playoffs are generally better teams overall. They're generally better at throwing the football and being more aggressive, creating and generating more explosive plays. It's not like the Eagles have given up a lot of explosive plays through the air this year. In fact, they've given up the least amount of 20-plus yard passes in the NFL this season, right? But when you look at recent weeks, and especially in rematches against previous teams, we've seen some reps be put on tape of teams having success when they are trying to push the ball a little bit further down the field, or when they're not just completely ignoring Quinyon Mitchell and actually trying to throw at him sometimes, right? So I think we're going to see teams try and be more aggressive. I'm not saying for sure that teams are going to come out and have a bunch of success, but when you look at trying to either run against this defense or pass against this defense, It's been a lot of times when they give up touchdown drives, it's like you have to scratch and claw and fight for every yard that you get. I think we're going to see teams try and take some one-on-one shots down the sidelines against Darius Slay and against Quinyon Mitchell, right? We saw double move from Brandon Cooks against Darius Slay last week. I think we're going to see more of that type of stuff as we get into the playoffs, right? But that'll be my weakness that I am paying attention to. It's not really a weakness. It's kind of hard to find a weakness with the defense, but it's gonna be something that I think teams are gonna try and exploit, try and generate explosives by being more aggressive. But that's it for our podcast this week. We got Eric. I know I saw Penn State is gonna be moving on to the semifinals. The Horns are moving on to the semifinals as well. What are you thinking about the matchup next week? Do we know who they're playing yet?
The winner of
right?
Georgia versus Notre Dame. I think Notre Dame has really impressed me, so they could actually win it all, in my opinion. Georgia, yeah, we know they're always a juggernaut, but they're vulnerable in my opinion. So anything is gravy for Penn State. They've had like a decade of disappointing. They've had a pretty soft schedule, but they do have a lot of future pros on that roster. So to be honest with you, I hone in more on the players, but I do hope they take home the championship. But just hoping for the best.
Yeah, well, that will be it for today's podcast. We will be back with a review podcast next week. But as always, make sure to like, subscribe, and spread the word. And until next time, go Birds.